So I will first draw you a bit the macroeconomic picture and our forecast for 2013. Okay, the striking point clearly is that we will have a recession in the Eurozone. And you see, so for the moment, minus 0.1, maybe a little more even, minus 0.4. So clearly it seems that the outlook for Europe will not be so much different than what happened in 2012. And of course, I want to insist on the fact that there are three very large economies which will have their GDP contracting. You see the very, very difficult recession in Italy, in Spain, and also in France, minus 0.2%, for France. So clearly those are the main feature. And you see that on other areas of the world, we will deal with quite a very strong growth. And you see that even we expect a small slowdown in the US, 1.5 is still a decent growth. And we also forecast an acceleration in the case of emerging markets. So clearly you see a world that is cut in two between Europe and the rest of the world. Now, how do corporates will cope with this very difficult environment in Europe? Now, you look here, we have looked at some data, which are the overall financial data. On the right, you have corporate profits. On the left, you have self-financing and the debt situation of the corporate sector. So you have three kinds of corporates. I would say first, the Italian and French case, where you have very low profitability, but very low debt and also very low self-financing. This means clearly that French and Italian corporates are extremely fragile and extremely dependent on, first, the credit market, secondly, the overall macroeconomic picture and growth. If you look at Spanish corporates or UK corporates, you see a very high level of profit. Yes, it is true. Spanish corporates have recently very strongly restored their profitability situation, but also very high debt. It means that, yes, they have high profits, but it doesn't mean that they will use this cash to boost investment, because they will use this cash to reimburse their future debt, which is very large, as it is shown in the chart. And finally, the winners are, well, Germany and the US, very strong profitability, very low debt, and of course, a very low dependency on credit. So clearly you see that facing a different macroeconomic environment, corporates themselves are in a very different situation according to what country they are in. Now, if you look at sectors, here we have drawn a kind of hierarchy of sectors in Europe, mostly. And the risky sectors are clearly the ones who are extremely dependent on consumption. You can see the retail, you can see, of course, the housing sectors, which have produced a lot of claims for Coface in 2012 and seems to us very risky in 2013. But it's true that sectors, of course, are very vulnerable to macroeconomic environment. I would add the fact that this vulnerability is also very high because of long-term structural issues. When you look at the retail sector, for example, in Europe, we have seen the recent bankruptcies of HMV in the UK or Virgin in France. In fact, those sectors, of course, have had to face the contraction of consumption, but also the fact that it didn't adapt to online trade, which has exploded. So there has been a technological shock on these sectors, and in fact, they didn't adapt. So clearly, sectors are fragile also because they have these structural problems, not only because of the macroeconomic environment. Now, let's look at Germany, of course, which is, there has not been very good news in terms of growth for Germany. The economy has clearly slowing down and is going to slow down a bit in 2013. Nevertheless, despite of a not brilliant macroeconomic environment, German corporates are strong. And they are strong enough to face this environment. Now you see the rate of bankruptcies, and you see Germany in green and France in blue. Well, clearly this ratio of bankruptcies on the total number of corporates, you see that since 2007, the German rate is half the French one. So clearly you have a resilience of German corporates that is very strong. This is due to many aspects. One aspect being that, financially speaking, on average, German corporates are stronger. The second aspect is that German bankruptcies, according to our statistical studies, depend on export. And exports since 2009 have been very, very strong in Germany. So that's, of course, a strength. Yes, fewer bankruptcies, but some very large ones. That's typical of Germany. You do have few bankruptcies, but they are very costly. And you see, for example, the Schlecker Group, the retail sector. You see, it's a huge corporate, billions of euros of turnover. So this is something. This is, of course, a risk for players because these bankruptcies are extremely costly and make a lot of damages despite their low numbers. The French case, of course, is different from Germany, and we see clearly increasing risk in corporates for France. Here you see our data on bankruptcies in France. First, the number of bankruptcies in France is stuck at a very high level. It doesn't decrease very much, around 60,000 bankruptcies a year. Remember that before the crisis, we were at 45,000 bankruptcies a year. But what's absolutely awful in France is that we see that the size of bankruptcy, their economic cost in terms of loss of employment, their economic cost in terms of financial cost, if you look at the overall debt to suppliers of insolvent corporates, is increasing very, very much. It means that what you see is that, yes, in France we have a lot of small corporates that are fragile, but what has been very fragilized is bigger and bigger corporates. And I said that French corporates are of course different from German corporates. German corporates are dependent on export in terms of insolvencies. In France, of course, we are dependent on consumption. Most of the corporates in France are more domestic oriented, and we forecast next year a contraction of consumption in France. Therefore, an increase of the number of bankruptcies. We were at little more than 60,000 in 2012. We expect 62,000 bankruptcy in 2013. But there is worse than the French and the French case. There's of course Italy and Spain. We have seen, of course, booming bankruptcies since the crisis. I think the number has been multiplied by 7, for example, in Spain. But there are two different cases. In the case of Italy, as I said, Italian corporates are not very largely indebted. The problem is that very often they are extremely dependent on consumption, and as you know, in 2012 and again in 2013, consumption has had a dramatic shock in Italy. A new feature that has been striking in Italy, traditionally Italian corporates are extremely supported by banks, and you see that since mid-2012, you see on the right the green line. You see that since 2012, credit has decreased in Italy, credit to corporates, meaning that the banks have stopped supporting corporates. So the credit crunch in Italy also plays a very negative role. The Spanish story is, of course, different. You have a lot of very largely indebted corporates in Spain, so they are trapped, in fact, in the debt problem. Of course, there are some good news in Spain. The fact that finally the banking reform has had a very positive step. But the problem is that the first effect of the banking reform is rather negative for corporates because the banks have to deleverage. They have to clean their balance sheet, meaning they will supply less credit. So here also, we expect in 2013 more difficulties for Spanish corporates. Yes, there are some advanced economies that more or less resist. The case of the US, here you see the confidence of small and medium enterprise, and of course, I would say that for these two large economies, risk doesn't really improve. In the case of US, it's stable. What you see clearly is that this confidence of small corporates is a bit more volatile now. And of course, the problem in the US is the expectations in terms of the macroeconomy, the macro policy, and the budget policy. There is no ability today of the US to draw a clear picture of what's going to be the budget policy for 2013, so with all the stories of the fiscal cliff that now repeats almost every month. So this, of course, plays a negative role for the capacity, for the ability of corporates to project themselves in the future. But it's not dramatic, but it means that despite a resilient growth, corporates are a bit prudent. On the case of Japan, the same thing, a lot of volatility since 2008 for the confidence of small and medium corporates. And here you have a problem for Japanese corporates, is the fact, of course, that you have difficulty in the electronic sector, more and more competition from South Korea, for example, but also the fact that the difficult relations with China also has had an effect on Japanese export to China, and these exports play a very important role for Japanese corporates. So here also a little a little deterioration. Now, if you look at our assessments, and I remind you that our assessments really target corporate risk in a given countries. These are not assessments of the sovereign risk, but really the corporate risk. So, not many good news. We have put a negative watch on Japan, but Japan is assessed A1. A1 is really still a very, very good assessment because Japanese corporates do pay well. But it's true that the 2013 context is a little less better because of this Chinese aspect. Two announcements. We are downgrading in B, Spain and Italy. You see that during 2012 we have downgraded a lot already Italian and Spanish corporates, but again we believe that in 2013 the risk is increasing. So the only positive news is the positive watch on the assessment A4 of Iceland. Iceland is a very small country. It will not contribute to the global growth of advanced economies. But it's a very interesting case because Iceland restructured its debt. Iceland also restructured its banking system. So there is some hope in some countries for some economies that were in very deep crisis. And Iceland now is doing well, has a very stable and high growth. And that's a good news. Some countries can get out of financial crisis. My conclusion is the following one. Yes, it is true that I would say the sovereign systemic risk of the Eurozone has decreased. It has not disappeared. When you look at what's happening in the Italian politics now, there are still some issues about the ability of many European countries to deal with their huge sovereign debt. Nevertheless, I would say that the prospect of a collapse of the Eurozone clearly is a less probable. But the crisis of the corporate sector, of the real economy, is still there and is not going to improve this year. Thank you.